Hi, welcome to the State of the Nation. I'm your host, Mike Sham, and we are doing a little bit more investigation into some new legislation proposed by our government, and that is to allocate water based on race. Yeah, you did hear me correctly. I'm sure many of you have read about it, but there is some legislation proposed where your water will be allocated according to the color of your skin. Now, we do understand that our government has an obsession with farming, and I thought rather than us trying to work it out, let's hear from somebody who does understand farming. And with me today from the Southern African Agriculture Initiative, Dr. Theo de Jager from SAAI. Hello, Theo. Welcome to the State of the Nation.
Hi, Mike, and thank you so much for inviting me to this platform.
Yeah, look, I just thought that this is legislation that's going to affect the state of the nation. We're going to have potentially a devastating bit of legislation coming into law that could actually affect our food security because of the way our agriculture is structured at the moment. Tell us a little bit more about the proposed act.
Yeah, the proposed regulations. Yeah, for the allocation of water rights. Actually, it's for granting water licenses, which is the final stage of a 20-year-long 3-stage program. First, as farmers, we had to register our water as we used it in 1998. And this process went from about 2002 to 2006. And then there was a verification program. Government had to verify each one of those registrations. And then you can apply for a license, which ultimately grants you the right to use the water. And we fear that these regulations might now be applicable to those water licenses which have not yet been granted. Although government says it will only apply to new licenses, but for most of us who still do not have a license, it will be a new license. Okay. And government says, the Department of Water and Sanitation, they say that there are 3 foundations of logic for these regulations. The first is that they say the use of water, the right to water, must reflect the composition of the population. That's the minister's mandate, they say. But 65% of our population is urbanized. We cannot understand why somebody who lives in a flat in Sunnyside or Hillbrow must be entitled to the same right to use water as a farmer who must grow their food with it. Secondly, the department says that farmers use 63% of all the water in the country. And we do. But there's no way to produce food without water. There's nothing you can produce without water. In every country, the farmers are the biggest users of water. If you cannot do that, you need to import your food. And in South Africa, water is scarce. We are the 3rd driest country south of the Sahara. It's only Botswana and Namibia which is drier than ourselves. On average, the South African farmer is actually highly efficient in the way we use water. We produce more with less water than most other countries. Then thirdly, they say that 98% of all the water sources are still in white hands. Now, of course, we have a massive problem with that statistic, and in SAAI we actually dropped a PAIA application, a Public Access to Information Act application on the minister, asking them for their calculations and the data and the methodology behind the research and the results of the research. We want to see where that number comes from.
Yeah, and I presume that that's going to take a while to get the source of that data.
Well, the director for allocations in the department, Mr. Sipho Skosana, said on ENCA last week that they have it. That this is a result of their research. They've made the calculations. And the reason why we question it, if it was true that 98% of the water resources are in white hands, what happened to the water of the 27% of the land that's been transferred up to now? Did they transfer it without the water? And if so, why? And about 25% of the land mass in South Africa belongs to government. What about that water? And another 14% are former homelands, the tribal trust areas, the communal areas. And surely those farmers have water rights. They always had it. What happened to those water rights?
Yeah.
And then the mines are some of the biggest users of water and industry. And what about primary use? Villages, towns, cities. That water is definitely not in white hands. So we question this narrative that 98% of the water are in white hands.
Yeah, look, it's an impossible statistic, because it would mean that you'd have to own all of the rivers and reservoirs and all these other uses. And I mean, just in the few that you've mentioned, that 64% already that we understand wouldn't be in white hands. But this obviously forms part of a long-standing program, together with expropriation, to change the face of ownership of farmland in South Africa.
Mike, it's very difficult to say exactly how the nuts and the bolts fit on each other in these regulations, because the regulations, the proposed regulations, say if you use more than a certain volume, and that volume is enough for the production of more or less 25 hectares of fruit, or say about 30 hectares of vegetables or lucerne, exactly what must you share? For what must you have now a black partner? If you use more, you need a 50% share to be transferred. And for the bigger farmers, a 75% share. But of what? Is it of the volume of the water? Is it of your dam? Because in practical terms, that's where the water is. It's in our dams. And from there, it goes through a distribution network. And from there, it goes to your irrigation system. And all of those cost you way more than the land on which you use it. One farmer called me to say, I've been struggling for the last 2 years to pay for this dam. I still owe 18 million rand for my dam. And if I can have a partner, can he share 75% of my debt on the dam too? A pivot that, for example, irrigates a 16-hectare circle cost you 6-7 times more than what the land would cost you. And farmers buy that not in cash. They have a loan from a bank to pay it. And it's unclear exactly what would your partner now own. It is a form of expropriation, or what we call creeping expropriation, because it's something we always had. Many farmers had that right for 4-5 generations, and then we had to register it. And then they verified, do you really use it? And then licensing. And in the meantime, you are forced to sacrifice a portion of it. So it's not an expropriation like a piece of land would be expropriated. It's this creeping expropriation.
Yeah, it's just a way of making it impossible for you to operate your farm till you get to the point where you hand over the keys, I presume.
Yes, and the water is the scarce resource. I remember when we started registering, I was a young chairman of a farmers association in Trigarsdal at the time, and the farmers quarreled with each other. Should we? And should we be accurate with it? Should I register less than what I really use because maybe I have to pay for it in future, which since then we have to do? Or should I register more? And there was an old man, Gert van der Merwe, who said, guys, we will one day buy water and then look for the land to use it on. Water is the scarce resource.
Well, I think I could challenge you there, because I don't think that water is necessarily the scarcest resource. The scarcest resource is the skill to do the right thing with the water. If you gave me the farm with the most abundant water and put me on that farm right now, right, believe me, there's not going to be too much production by the next season, because I wouldn't know where to start. I mean, to say that water is just one part of it, right? Water isn't the hard part. The hard part is actually knowing what to do with that water.
And how to stretch it.
But
you see, the market will sift it out. If you have this water on a piece of land, as Mike, and next year you have no harvest, there will be 10 farmers queuing to buy your water from you.
Now, give me a breakdown, Theo, the difference between, we've obviously farming is no longer just something, you don't just sit on your porch with some grass in your between your teeth and look at the sunset. That's a business. It's, it's a way of life and a business. And I've seen in my lifetime, and like I said to you off air, I'm a city boy, but I do understand what's going on here. Agriculture is no longer what it used to be. It's now become quite a scientific process, It's become a business. What proportion of our farms are family owned versus corporate, if you want to call it that, or owned by bigger companies, big agricultural groupings?
It's actually an unfair question, because the big corporates, they farm on massive tracts of land. They have many farms. The real question should be, what percentage of production comes from family farms and what percentage comes from these corporate farms? Now, around 95-96% of our production are still in the hands of family farmers. And when I use the terminology family farmers, a family farmer is not big or small. He's not rich or poor. He's not a well-established farmer or a newcomer. He's not black or white. It's a family whose business is on a farm, who ekes out a living from a piece of land. And in South Africa, it is pretty much still family-driven. You have areas like the Midwest in the USA, eastern parts of Australia, where this tendency of big farmers growing bigger all the time, smaller farmers dropping out of the industry, have now resulted in a few massive farmers producing most of the food. And it is our crusade in SAAI, this is in the DNA of SAAI, of trying to protect your smaller and medium-scale family farm. For us, we have an issue with a family name on a board on a pole at the gate, which links a certain family to a certain piece of land. In family farming, there's something of multi-generational planning, because the land and the brand, the family name as a brand, and the presence in a value chain is being passed on from grandparents to the parents, to the children, to the grandchildren. You plan way ahead. We always say you did not inherit it from your parents. You are borrowing it
Yeah.
from your children.
Right.
And this is where what you've just mentioned, the scarce resource of the skills comes in. Because you don't just parachute somebody into a family farming operation and think they will make a success out of it. It's such a multidimensional business. A farmer is today also an engineer, a human resource manager, a financial manager, a procurement manager. And then you are competing against nature all the time. I will never be a very good farmer because I started too late in my life. I do not come from a family farm. My son have a much better chance than I have to be a great farmer because he was raised on a farm. It is not about knowing how. It's about emotionally managing a farm. It's about waking up one morning to see that the hailstorm has taken out everything. And then have enough in you to say, I will now start over again.
Yeah.
There's nothing else you can do. And this is the part where the disconnection between a second and often a third generation of urbanized South Africans and the producers come in. And we take responsibility for it. I don't think as farmers, our communication with our consumers is what it should be. We are not the best communicators. Because the most important people in our lives are people in cities who walk into a shop and stand in front of a shelf and deciding what they will have for dinner tonight. But for many of them who no longer have an uncle or a grandpa on a farm, their experience of food ends in front of the shelf. And the world behind the shelf, there where the seed and the climate and the water and the mechanization and the business plan must get together. Of that, they know very little. And then they put pressure on us to do stuff which they think will be right, but in practice cannot work. They pressure us not to use insecticides. But if we don't use it, the insects will eat everything before it lands on that shelf. And no one will buy fruit that's been half eaten by an insect. They don't want us to use synthetic fertilizers. If you don't use it, instead of having a 6 ton per hectare yield, you only have a 2 tons per hectare yield. And there's not enough to feed the nation. Now, we don't know it in South Africa, because in your and my lifetime, we've never had a food security issue in South Africa. Since the Second World War, we never had shortages. We are blessed to live in a country where we have forever been a net exporter of food. But that's not guaranteed. It becomes tougher and tougher all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, and your, I suppose the country's room for movement, you know, like I've said, you know, I've had 1 or 2 experiences in my entire life where I've genuinely gone hungry with no access to food, and you know, I'm not. So I've been blessed. But the one thing that you've got to, you know, that people don't quite understand is what happens when food is problematic. Right? It becomes the thing that absolutely dominates everything in your life. You know, so we're talking short term, but at that point in time, you pretty much do whatever you can to satisfy this problem that's inside of you. And if the country starts getting that gets, you know, it's well documented what happens in countries that have food shortages. It's a very real problem.
Especially on our continent and in our region. Although we've forever had national food security, we do not have regional food security. There's not enough food in Southern Africa for everybody. And in South Africa, although we enjoy national food security, there's enough food in the country. We have way too many issues with household food security. There are too many families who do not know what they will eat tonight. Now, food security no longer means that a country produce everything they consume, or consume everything they produce, the world became a very small place for farmers. Every farmer is every day in competition with the best other farmers in the world, and food and fiber flows across borders as if they don't exist. So in the 2020s paradigm of food security, the definition is actually that you produce enough of that in which you have a competitive advantage, so that you can exchange from the food basket for that in which you do not have a competitive advantage. For example, until 2006, we produced about 1/3 of all the tea we drink in South Africa. And the climate is still the same. Everything is still the same. But today, we don't produce a single bag of tea because we cannot compete against Rwanda and Ethiopia and Kenya and Tanzania and Burundi because of labor.
Yeah.
Only fingers can pick those 2 leaves in a bud. There's no machine that can do that. And because of labor issues, they can produce it so much cheaper than we can. It's better for us to import it. Why must you exchange from the food basket? Because, for example, the Japanese argue that they are a small island state, very small farms. They produce mostly rice. And they say we exchange computers and mobile phones and cars for food. It's because you can never predict when a pandemic would strike, like COVID, or a war between Russia and Ukraine, and all of a sudden there's not enough food. And we've seen it with India and Sri Lanka being the first 2 countries to close their borders and say, we will no longer export anything. We must first feed our own people. Then you need to be able to say, but I can exchange food for food.
Now, while we're talking about the exchange of food, South Africa is in a fortunate position where we do produce surpluses in certain things, which we can exchange for the things we have shortage of. I know that that some of our agricultural exports are tied up when that go to weird and wonderful places. And you explained how you sell lychees to West Africa, which is a wonderful story. It's sort of old-fashioned thinking that all of our food goes to the first world, but sometimes we've got a thriving market a lot closer to us. But we obviously have beneficial arrangements, especially with the US, in sending. I know they get a lot of our citrus, right, under AGOA. They get a lot of wine, which of course is used to be grapes back before it turned into something better. Could this potentially be another big problem for the South African farmer? Don't want to heap it on you here.
We are holding our hearts, Mike. We are really worried about AGOA. If AGOA goes, the whole of the Western Cape goes. Yeah. Our district in the Letaba, where we grow avocados and mangoes and citrus and macadamias, we won't survive it. We need those preferential trade agreements.
Because practically what would happen, they would now, you'd still have the market, but now they'd charge you you'd have to pay a tariff.
Yes, we will get much less for our products, and they will import much less.
Yeah.
They will rather import from some of our competitors.
Sure.
We will lose those markets. And with those markets goes a lot of job opportunities. In South Africa, different to Europe, for example, our export industries are pretty much labor-driven, not mechanized. We don't have these robots. And we don't pick with an implement behind a tractor. We use hands. And we create those jobs where we need it most, in the deep rural areas. And farmers employ people for those jobs which are unemployable elsewhere.
Yeah.
They don't need any kind of schooling. They don't even need to speak English or Afrikaans. And in the deep rural areas where we farm, there are thousands of those people coming to our farms every day to look for a job. It's not as if they can just go and fit in somewhere else in the economy.
Yeah. Now, there is some similarity. I know it was a big talking point 20 or so years ago, where our mines were still quite labor-intensive compared to what was happening overseas, and the South African mines had resisted mechanization of the mines, and eventually, through a whole lot of bad policy, the mining company said, well, let's just do it. And now most of our mining is mechanized compared to before, where we used to have hundreds of thousands of mine workers, and it's led to massive amount of unemployment. Do you think that if you push one button too hard, it causes a problem somewhere else? And could the problem actually be in labor?
For sure. Especially in the export industries.
Because you'll then buy those machines that you're not currently using. Is that
you will have to?
Yeah.
And there are two buttons. The one can be pushed by the politicians, the policymakers, and the other one by the trade unions. Our labor forces in agriculture are not that well unionized. But from very expensive experience, I can tell you, when a trade union enters into a farm gate, the last piece of goodwill exits. Our labor relations is different from that of other industries because we live on the same yard. Our children goes to the same schools. If one of my laborers' wife is sick, we all know it. We all share in the pain. And labor action on a farm always comes at the same time, harvest time, when you can least afford it. And it's different to another factory where you can just lock the gates, lock the doors, and wait until the strike is over. When you have to harvest, you have to harvest. Not harvesting can be the end of this farm. So there is not much room for a third party in the relationship between farmers and their laborers. And this is one of the buttons which, you push it too hard, a farmer has no option but to replace people with machines.
Now, Theo, there is this perception. There's a perception that sort of, everybody sort of sits and waits for an issue of bad relations between farmers and their laborers. Is that justified?
There are farmers who do not play by the rules. Of course there are farmers who have bad relations with their laborers. But you might know, Mike, things have changed so much over the last 10, 20 years. A farm laborer is no longer just anybody you recruit from the street. A modern tractor is highly digitalized. It speaks to its implement, and the implements speak to each other. A farm is a network these days of the Internet of Things. Every year we need to produce more on less and with less, which means you need to do precision farming. You need to make every seed count and every drop of water count. And there's only one way to do it, and that is to upgrade the skills of your workers too. And just like you find farmers who often sit on the same piece of land for 3, 4, 5 generations, we have in the wine industry 8th generation farmers. Very often laborers also come with those families. 3, 4, 5 generations of people who are on the same farm. I have every month competition from neighbors who try to lure my workers for a higher wage. And often I need skills. And instead of taking a year or two to develop those skills. It's easier for me just to try to buy someone else's who already have those skills. So there's a competition for good labor. And you cannot then have poor relations. And anyway, the two main headaches for farmers in South Africa, which other farmers elsewhere do not understand, is this worrying that you might not have this farm anymore in 2 or 3 years from now with expropriation without compensation, or the way land reform is being managed. And the other one is, of course, farm safety, farm attacks and farm murders. Now, your first safety net is the laborers. They are also victims. When we lost 8 farmers in 8 days last week, 2 of them were actually farm laborers. They are not being spared. You cannot afford to have poor relations with your labor. We will never try to cover up for poor labor relations. But I will bet my front teeth that in general, the relationship between farmers and their laborers are better than any other industry, because we live so much closer to each other.
Yeah.
We don't go home at 5 o'clock and come back at 8 o'clock.
Yeah. Now, in closing, Theo, let's just have a look at options here, because obviously we're looking at a really blunt instrument, and nothing can be more blunt than water rights to a farmer. And that's about as blunt as it gets. I mean, I suppose the other blunt instrument could be shareholding, but that kind of falls into the same category. For South African farmers, right, and faced with this particular threat, I presume the first step is to try and head it off at the pass, hope that sanity prevails. Is there any chance of a reasonable discussion with government to get them to think about this differently?
We sincerely believe so. I think there are 4 angles to lobbying against doing advocacy. The first is in the public participation process, which is still open until the 17th, and which we are trying to extend now, because we don't have the data which the government used to compile these regulations, and we say we also want to comment on that. So we need them to extend. But there's this public participation process, and every farmer must. You must take part. You must have your voice heard. The same with every farmers organization, commodity organization, cooperative, all farmer structures must have their voice heard. We also whipped up some support amongst consumer organizations, saying your voice is also needed now. Secondly, there's the legal route. We can challenge the constitutionality of these regulations, and we also can challenge the content. We are now challenging the science behind it through this PAIA application. But then there's a keen interest from embassies in this. If you think that public services have collapsed in our SOEs and in public health care, very much the same thing happened in international relations, and the embassies are not being serviced the way they used to. And we found out already 3-4 years ago that embassies have a need for more information, and we started to service them and created capacity to do that in a dedicated manner. And we were simply overwhelmed by requests for more information from the embassies. So the international community also try to keep their fingertips on this issue. And we have seen quite a lot of reaction. Just see what CNN said about it. And radio stations in the USA and in Germany and in the Netherlands, the comments they made about this. But then there's also creating the alternatives. In wrestling with government, to withdraw these, we decided that we will not just try to fight the wolf. We will come up with better proposals. There are better ways of doing it. And the best one, the best tested one up to now, have been the partnership-driven model for land reform. We used to call it the Quran Plan when Professor Mohammed Quran was still heading up the Faculty of Agriculture at the University of Stellenbosch, because he was the architect of this model of land reform. And this model have been tested in all 9 the provinces, and less than 5% of it failed. This is where an existing commercial farmer or farming family partners up with the beneficiary of land reform. And instead of waiting 2 or 3 generations to become profitable, you can be it in 1 generation, because you are piggybacked on the enterprise of a family who already have made all the mistakes. You save all the school fees.
Yes. And then, of course, I want to close off with, you mentioned embassies, which sort of leads me to the last point. You know, I'm a firm believer, and I was very proud of myself that I could correct you that water isn't your best resource. You know, that sometimes it's the skill, because all the water in the world can help a bad farmer, I would imagine. The skills these days, you talk about the fact that I can go get bananas 12 months a year. I never used to be able to, right? That speaks to a globalized, the global village. There's also a global village for talent. We hear a lot about farmers farming in different places to where they used to farm. Now, those embassies that are keeping a close eye on what you're doing, and you're supplying some data to them, are they also putting feelers out for farmers to go and farm in countries where they're in desperate need of resourceful farmers like we have in South Africa?
The African embassies, yes. We actually have set up an organization for them 10 years ago, Agri All Africa. In Agri All Africa, we now represent just more than 4,000 South African and Zimbabwean farmers who are farming in 44 countries in Africa. This continent is paradise, Mike.
Yeah.
There's no better continent to farm on than this one. On this continent, we still have 46% of the world's underutilized land, and even a larger chunk of its groundwater sources. We have everything which money cannot buy: the soils, the water, the climate, the people. But we don't have the infrastructure, the linkages to markets, the expertise and the experience, and we don't have property rights. There are only 4 countries on this continent where you can own farmland: South Africa and Namibia, and small pockets of Zambia and Botswana. And theoretically, of course, Zimbabwe, but we all know what happened in Zimbabwe. And if you don't have property rights, you don't have the same kind of investment. We cannot unlock the wealth of agriculture if there's not property rights, because there's no collateral. You don't have access to financing. So we are working very hard to also try to influence policymakers elsewhere in Africa to unlock this wealth. And South African farmers, I will never claim that we understand Africa. We know we don't understand Africa. But we understand her much better than the Chinese or the Brazilians or the Dutch or the Americans or the Russians or any of the other aggressive investors on the continent. We have a few stones in our stomach after 3.5 centuries of farming here. And we love this continent. We love the conditions to farming on this continent. We understand the necessity to sit under a tree for 6 days to negotiate a piece of land. And most important, we understand that there is no such a thing as land without people. You want to utilize the land, you marry those people. It's a long-term relationship. You need to like each other.
Dr. Theo de Jager, you've left us with a wonderful point. To everybody that's watched us today, this is a very important topic. It could affect a supermarket near you. South Africa, as Theo pointed out, has always had food security. This is severely under threat. And I thought it was very important that we spoke to somebody who knows. If there's anybody in government that would love to come and sit here and explain the thinking behind it, we'd love to have you here, but we're still yet to succeed in getting anybody from government to come and speak to us, Theo. But if you enjoyed this today, please subscribe to our State of the Nation channel. The more subscribers we get, the more content we can put out. If you really like us, become a member of our supporters club. And if you want to hear what some other people think of some of these legislations that are coming to pass, come and join us at our live business breakfast on the 10th of July at the Sandton Convention Centre. Details will be below this video. But Theo de Jager, thank you so much for joining us today. To everybody that watched it, thank you so much. And we'll see you again on the State of the Nation. Thank you, Theo.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for the privilege of sharing your platform.